Welcome back to the channel. We got a little bit of different, a change of pace for this next video. I'm going to be covering a video with Dr. Paul Saladino from the Carnivore MD channel. And he is actually on there's a video interview with him, and I don't remember the guy's name, but it's a guy from Bare Performance podcast, I believe. So let's go ahead and check that out. This particular video is about something that I've talked on and touched on in several other videos, and that's the danger of seed oils. So let's cover some of that.
So what I'm wondering is, where did we transition in time in the last couple of decades where seed oils were forward, leading from the front, and we've kind of eliminated a lot of beef fat, or it's been considered unhealthy? And where do you think that transition happened in the last couple of years?
Oh, it's pretty clear. The history of this is fascinating. There was no such thing as a seed oil before 1870, and then it was first used as a machine lubricant. So they would grind up seeds and use the oil as a machine lubricant. It wasn't really popularized for human consumption until 1910, 1911 with Crisco. Mm-hmm. We have a story about Crisco we could tell later, but this was, I believe, they had this excess machine lubricant, and they were thinking like, oh, let's use this for human consumption. This will be great. It doesn't spoil as well. It's cheaper. It's lighter. And it didn't really catch on until I think the 1950s, and I'll tell that part of the story in a moment. But if you look at human health, and of course, 1910, 1900, 1870, 1890, not quite the same as we have now with medicine, but we had records, right? We pretty much knew what a heart attack was, and heart attacks were very rare. Diabetes, very rare. Obesity, very rare. There's photos from even 60 years ago, and we look at humans, and they were much less fat than we are today. People post these photos on Instagram all the time, 1950s at the beach, 1960s at the beach.
So that's an important point that's being made here. If you look at the consumption of red meat, the consumption of animal fats, and you also look at the consumption of seed oils, and then you look at the rates of metabolic diseases and the rates of cardiovascular disease, you will see a trend where the increasing amounts of seed oil, the increasing amounts of grain being consumed, and increasing amounts of refined carbohydrates mirrors this rise in modern diseases like heart disease, diabetes, other metabolic disorders, cancer. What you see, though, is you see the inverse when it comes to our consumption of animal fats. Our consumption of animal fats has fallen over the last 50, 60 years, and even our consumption of red meat has fallen off. But these diseases that a lot of people like to point at as being the supposed cause for modern diseases that I've mentioned, it's people often point at red meat, or they often point at animal fats and saturated fats and say it's their fault, that's the cause, and yet we don't see that correlation in the data in terms of how much of that is consumed in the United States. And so that's just what I'm talking about here. It's just the United States. So
it's all skinny people. But even I'm sure if you wind back even further to the 1900s, early 1900s, we had a lot of skinny people. We didn't have a lot of massive, obese, overweight humans like we do today. And we can get into those numbers. They're staggering. What the combination of obesity and overweight today is enormous. So there's a clear transition in the last 100 to 110 years. Seed oils really didn't exist before, let's just say, late 1800s, and then introduced into the human supply chain early 1900s. Now, along with that, again, this is all correlation, so we have to be careful. We can only draw a hypothesis from this, which we must test, and we can go into all of the lines of evidence that make me very concerned.
I love the fact that he said this. This is such an important point that I will make again and again and again. When we see correlation, that's we cannot infer causation, but we can say, hey, there's something, these two things correlate and we should be testing that. Now they have done studies, interventional studies that look into specifically swapping out animal-based saturated fats for vegetable-based oils. And those studies did not go well for the people who were put onto the vegetable-based oils. One thing we'll note is that those vegetable-based seed oils did lower the LDL of those individuals, but it did not produce longevity. It did not produce less heart attacks, less disease, less strokes, less all-cause mortality. All-cause mortality increased in that population that had their animal-based saturated fats swapped out for highly processed industrial vegetable seed oils instead of animal-based saturated fat. So there are studies that show that there is some causation there, right? There's not enough studies, and those studies that were done have often been hidden or not widely publicized, and in some cases just not published for 50 years. So not saying there was a cover-up, I'm just saying that for whatever reason the scientists didn't get the results they expected, so they chose not to publish their data, and it was published much later, decades and decades later, and now we're starting to see that data come to light. And it's calling into a lot of question a lot of this assertion that that polyunsaturated fatty acids, consuming massive quantities of them, is healthy in any way, shape, or form.
But these are all just observational correlations. But with the introduction of seed oils from 1910, we see a steady rise in chronic illness. All of it tracks together, gradually increasing rates of obesity, gradually increasing rates of cancer, gradually increasing rates of heart disease, gradually increasing rates of diabetes. And the most significant data we have is probably in the last 50 years, and the trend has continued. But that trend goes all the way back to the early 1900s. Again, just correlation, but we can talk about why I think there's a really compelling hypothesis to be drawn from that. And then I think it was in the mid to early 1950s that I think it was President Lyndon Johnson had a heart attack.
So I actually think this was President Eisenhower. I think Ike was the one that had the heart attack. But the question is, was it the meat he was eating? Was it the fat he was eating? Or was it the fact that he smoked several packs of cigarettes a day? So I think we know that smoking several packs of cigarettes a day is not healthy for you and can contribute to cardiovascular disease. So it's just interesting what was latched onto.
It just captured the American imagination, and we thought, why did this hero, this paragon of our culture, have a heart attack? And I think it almost took him out of office. My history's a little fuzzy there, but that was the beginning of the medical system and the American Heart Association and the American Medical Association beginning to vilify cholesterol, and then in connection with that, animal fats.
This is also about the time that you start to see the food pyramid come into play. And so the food pyramid was designed by a committee that was not initially tasked with that in any way. As Dr. Paul Saladino said, this is something that had captured the minds of the American public. And so what they had seen was that people were looking for an answer to what happened here. And one thing that happened was there was this committee, it was McCarthy, no, it was McGovern. Yeah, it's McGovern. Yeah, sorry, not McCarthy, McGovern. A committee tasked with something else. They finished that task early, and so then they decided to take on this look at the American diet and come up with recommendations, which is how we ended up with the food pyramid. Now, there were scientists that were a part of this that objected to making these changes. They were pushing back and saying that we need to test these changes, right? We need to do analysis of this, and we need to study this impact of these changes to our diet. The reply was, we don't have time to study this. We must do something now. So basically it was like, any change is better than no change, and that's a recipe for disaster. So a knee-jerk reaction, we're just gonna do something so that we can claim we did something. All right, we really need to leave these things to scientists, and it needs to be scientific discourse in the scientific community in a scientific manner, meaning keep it about data, acknowledging that epidemiological studies have gaps in them, that they don't prove causation, right? That interventional trials are the best way to prove causation, and that we can't infer causation when we've only seen correlation, and we should not fearmonger based on correlation alone. We should strive to get solid data that says, yes, this causes this.
In the 7-country study, which we can go into. But if we back up again for a moment and we look at the health of the population early 1900s, described that a little earlier, pretty darn good. I mean, I don't think everybody had amazing diets, but for the most part, there wasn't any seed oil in 1900 in the American diet. People were eating exclusively tallow, which is rendered beef fat, or lard. And the majority of pigs in 1900 were probably fed way better diets than they're fed today. The majority of pigs today get corn and soy. So we had animal fats, which were probably better for humans, and they were essentially 100% of the human diet.
So something interesting to note here is that pig's diet, when you were saying the modern pig's diet is primarily corn and soy, and those two grains are, well, one's a grain, one's a legume technically, but both of those are high in polyunsaturated fatty acids. And the thing about pigs is they don't convert because they're not ruminants, right? They're not a polygastric animal. They are monogastric, so they concentrate, right? So if there's 20% of their diet is polyunsaturated fatty acid, then probably about 20% of their fat on their body will be polyunsaturated fatty acids. And traditionally, when you look at wild animals, they are predominantly saturated fat and monounsaturated fat, maybe about 45% to 50% of each. It'll vary, but it's mostly saturated, a lot of unsaturated, and then that last 5%, usually it's 5 to 10%, is polyunsaturated. And we actually see these same numbers in the body fat of tribes of hunter-gatherers that are eating a very traditional primal or paleo kind of diet, right? A throwback way of eating, right? That people ate for millions of years. And when we eat that way, when we see groups of people that eat that way, then you see the polyunsaturated fatty acid composition of their body fat is also going to be, below 10%. They frequently see that 5% range. And so that's interesting because, we are also monogastric animals. So we don't convert a bunch of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. We can't convert it into, saturated and monounsaturated. So we just simply store it away, or we use it, right? We use it for processes. We use it to build structures within the body, or it gets stored.
The fats was animal fat, maybe a little bit of olive oil, but not even a whole lot in 1900. And so you're looking at butter, tallow, and lard as the main fats in the human diet. And the rates of chronic illness were very low. Diabetes, very low. Heart attacks, very low. Cancer, much lower. So you're thinking, wait, how come nobody talks about that, right? Again, it's a correlation. We see the introduction of seed oils. In the last 100 years, especially in the last 50 years, we know things have gone down the toilet. So it's a very interesting history, and it's been marketed to us as originally a cheaper, better alternative. It doesn't spoil. It looks clean. It's white. Crisco's, is pure white. Margarine is pure white. They have to put pills in it to make it look the same color as butter, which has flavonoids in it from the grass that the cows are eating. And the darker the butter is, the more grass the cow's eating. So it began with that. Again, it's a machine lubricant that got sold to humans as a food. And then in the 1950s, it became around cholesterol. And that was when the cholesterol hypothesis began. And the idea that LDL cholesterol, right? Low density lipoprotein. At that time, mostly we measured total cholesterol, but low density lipoprotein cholesterol was to blame for heart attacks. And that cholesterol was to blame for heart attacks. And what do we know? And this is probably the beginning of all of this piece of information. We know that saturated fat from animals raises LDL in a lot of people, not in everyone, but in a lot of people. So that was the beginning of the end for this, and why seed oils have subsequently been elevated to a place of near sacredness. Because, and we'll clarify these statements because they're very misleading as I say them. If you eat canola oil, right? If you eat seed oils, which are high in polyunsaturated fatty acids, we can talk about what makes us fat saturated versus polyunsaturated. Your LDL generally goes down. And LDL is this thing we think of as colloquially, quote unquote, bad cholesterol.
Yeah, this is a good place to jump in here. So again, LDL is a low density lipoprotein that your body produces and needs. And if you don't have enough of it, then very bad things happen to you. So having too much in the wrong conditions can be as bad as having too little. It's interesting to note that the conditions that make LDL dangerous are conditions that produce a lot of oxidation. So for example, eating diets that are high produce a lot of oxidative stress. Typically, those are diets that are high in refined or processed carbohydrates that will produce excess free radicals and excess oxidative stress. The other kind of thing that can damage LDL is glycation, and that's due to any kind of excessive blood sugar or exposure to excessive blood sugar and free radicals. So again, the same thing that would produce a lot of oxidative stress would also produce a lot of blood sugar, and that would be the consumption of excessive amounts of refined, processed carbohydrates that lead to insulin resistance, that lead to chronically high blood sugar. The other thing that we think is that these seed oils actually exacerbate this, right? They make it worse through creating an excessive amount of inflammation, which is also the additional thing that is needed to promote cardiovascular disease. So if you have excessive amounts of inflammation, you have damaged LDL, then this damaged LDL can slip under and into the areas of the endothelium of the arteries where the inflammation has occurred. And really, it's just these damaged LDL particles that are floating around the bloodstream. When LDL is damaged, it cannot be taken back up by the liver. The liver can't take it back up and recycle it and refill it and reuse it. It doesn't recognize it because it's damaged. So in that case, it just hangs about until it gets lodged somewhere. And so that is an instance in which, if you're eating a standard American diet, high in seed oils, high in grains, which are going to produce a lot of blood sugar, and high in refined processed carbohydrates, which are going to turn into a lot of blood sugar. And all of those together, they just produce the classic environment for heart disease. So there's a truth to the statement that LDL, high levels of LDL can be bad for you, but it's under the right circumstances. Now, if you don't have those other things, if you're not consuming a diet high in grains, a diet high in vegetable and seed oils, and a diet high in refined processed carbohydrates, then you may not have the conditions that are required to damage LDL and make it dangerous. And in that case, it doesn't really matter what that number is. And you will see that reflected in the type of LDL that you have in your body, which will either be type A or type B. Type A is the large, buoyant type, And type B is, I guess, the small particles. The analogy I use is if you poured sand all over your floor versus you poured, you dumped a bunch of beach balls on your floor, right? You would walk on the sand, it would be gritty, it would irritate, your feet, versus the beach balls, you would just bounce off of your legs and you would just be able to walk around the house. Beach balls wouldn't get, stuck, in between the tiles, but that sand might. So something to keep in mind there. There's a great video. If you want to watch the rest of it, I highly encourage you to watch the rest of this video. In fact, I highly encourage you to check out the Bare Performance podcast with Dr. Paul Saladino. I believe this is an excellent episode. There are several clips that Dr. Paul Saladino has shared from this podcast, and they are available on his channel, Carnivore MD. Again, if you like this context where I discuss studies and information related to diets and ancestral diets and modern diets, then please like and subscribe so that we can grow the channel. And we'll see you next time. Thanks again. So if you enjoyed today's information, I provide information just like this to my clients to help improve energy, burn fat, and build muscle through an ancestral lifestyle and diet. My program doesn't involve gimmicks like bars and shakes, counting points, tracking macros, or even spending hours and hours doing cardio in the gym. Now, I've not only used this program to help clients improve well-being and health, but I also used it as a part of my own personal transformation. So if you're looking for an easy, intuitive way of eating and simple lifestyle adjustments to improve your well-being, then click on the link in the description below to book your free no obligation discovery call today.